Differences between sample mean and population mean. Sample mean versus population mean. The sample mean is the average of a subset, sample of observations taken from a larger population. Whereas, the population mean is the average of all observations in a specific population. Sample mean is the arithmetic mean of random sample values drawn from population. Whereas, population mean represents the actual mean of the whole population. Symbol of sample mean is pronounced as X bar, whereas, symbol of population mean is pronounced by Greek term mu. Calculation of sample mean is easy, whereas, calculation of population mean is difficult. Accuracy of sample mean is low, whereas, accuracy of population mean is high. Standard deviation, when calculated using sample mean, is denoted by S, whereas, standard deviation, when calculated using population mean, is denoted by sigma. A sample is a statistic, whereas, the population is a parameter. Sample mean computed when the population size is too large or infinite, whereas, population mean computed when the population size is small. Formula of sample mean and population mean are given for comparison. Errors occur when the sample doesn't represent the population or when samples are collected unevenly. Whereas, no errors, the entire population is considered for mean computation. The sample mean may be biased due to sampling method used or characteristics of the sample. Whereas, the population mean is unbiased as it represents the true average of the entire population. Since the sample mean considers random sample values taken from the whole population, it may not provide accurate results. Whereas, the average calculated for the entire population is accurate and reliable. For sample mean, data collection and computation are easy. Whereas, the collection of population data and computation is a very tedious process. The sample data is acquired from the population, whereas, the population data is collected from records, censuses, etc. The sample mean is calculated by summing the values in the sample and dividing by sample size. Whereas, the population mean is calculated by summing all the values in the population and dividing by the population size. The sample mean is used in various statistical tests, such as t-tests and ANOVA, to assess differences between groups or variables. Whereas, the population mean may be used as a reference point in statistical tests or comparisons. The sample mean may vary from one sample to another, as different samples may yield different averages. Whereas, the population mean remains constant unless there are changes in the population itself. The sample mean is used to estimate the population mean and make inferences about the population based on sample. Whereas, the population mean is a known or unknown value that is of interest and may not require estimation. The sample mean can be used to make inferences and generalize findings to the larger population from which the sample was drawn. Whereas, the population mean represents the entire population and does not require generalization. The sample mean is based on a smaller subset of observations compared to the population mean. Whereas, the population mean considers all the observations in the population. The sample mean depends on sampling technique used to select the sample from the population. Whereas, the population mean is not influenced by the sampling technique as it represents the entire population. The sample mean is used in statistical inference techniques, such as hypothesis testing and confidence interval estimation. Whereas, the population mean may serve as a reference point for statistical comparisons or as a benchmark. The sample mean is typically less precise than the population mean due to the smaller sample size and variability. Whereas, the population mean is often more precise as it considers all the observations in the population. The sample mean tends to follow a normal distribution as the sample size increases, according to the central limit theorem. Whereas, the population mean does not require the central limit theorem as it represents the true average of the population. The sample mean is based on a specific sampling frame or the set of individuals or units from which the sample is drawn. Whereas, the population mean considers all individuals or units in the population. The sample mean has statistical properties, such as variance, standard deviation, and confidence interval, which are calculated based on the sample. Whereas, the population mean has statistical properties that describe the variability and distribution of the values in the population. The sample mean may be less efficient than the population mean in estimating the true average due to the smaller sample size. Whereas, the population mean is the most efficient estimator of the true average as it considers all the observations in the population. The sample mean may not accurately represent all the characteristics and parameters of the population mean. Whereas, the population mean represents all the characteristics and parameters of the population. The sample mean is often reported and analyzed in research studies when data collection is done on a subset of the population. Whereas, the population mean may be of interest in research studies, but it is not always feasible or practical to measure it directly. The sample mean's external validity refers to the degree to which the findings from sample can be generalized to population. Whereas, the population mean does not have external validity concerns as it represents the entire population. The sample mean is interpreted as an estimate or approximation of population mean based on the available sample data. Whereas, the population mean is interpreted as the true average of the entire population. The sample mean can be used to calculate a confidence interval that estimates range within which population mean likely falls. Whereas, the population mean does not require a confidence interval estimation as it represents the true average. The sample mean is often a key component in research design and data analysis when working with samples. Whereas, the population mean is relevant in research design when the entire population is accessible and measurable. Kindly subscribe my YouTube channel Thesis Helper. Thanks for watching.